Ma'am, where are your citizenship documents? Not the license, the real ones.
Excuse me? Who exactly asked you for that?
Don't get smart. People like you always raise red flags.
I've done nothing wrong. I'm just trying to travel.
Then prove you belong here, right now.
I don't need to prove my humanity to you.
The security cameras captured lead ICE agent Richard Rubio's voice cutting through the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport checkpoint like a blade. He demanded ancestral lineage documents tracing back 3 generations. 15 years on the job, dozens of deportations, a spotless record, and a federal pension waiting at the end. Untouchable. He told the woman she needed expired visas from childhood travel, all of them, that they needed to verify people like her. Katrine Wright stood silent at the security checkpoint, her carry-on at her feet. Jeans, a gray sweater, comfortable walking shoes. Nothing flashy, nothing memorable. Exactly how she wanted it. Rubio circled closer, his 2 colleagues flanking him like sentries. He asked if she understood what he was asking for, whether he needed to explain it slower. Passengers slowed their pace. Phones emerged from pockets. Security cameras captured every angle. What Rubio did next would cost him his badge, his freedom, and a secret he'd buried for years. If you are ready to see institutional racism taken down, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of cops messing with the wrong people and finding out. Let me know if you enjoyed the story. Let me tell you who Katrine Wright really was, because Agent Rubio had no idea, not a clue, and that ignorance would unravel him completely. Katrine was a retired federal judge who had spent 4 decades in the American legal system, the youngest black woman ever appointed to the federal bench in Minnesota, the first to preside over immigration and deportation proceedings in the entire Midwest region. She had ruled on hundreds of cases, dismantled countless bad faith arguments, and stared down federal agents who thought their badges made them untouchable. But you wouldn't know any of that by looking at her. Every day since her retirement in 2022, Katrine had chosen invisibility. Same modest wardrobe, same quiet routines. Same unremarkable presence that let her blend into grocery stores, coffee shops, airport terminals. She gardened in her St. Paul bungalow. She volunteered at the local library under her maiden name. She lived a life scrubbed clean of recognition. That was intentional. Being seen had a cost. Being noticed meant cameras, interviews, protesters outside courtrooms, death threats mailed to her chambers, editorials debating whether her rulings were too lenient or too harsh, whether she was a symbol of progress or a disappointment to her community. Every decision she made became a referendum on something larger than law. So Katrine made herself a ghost in plain sight. But here's what nobody knew, what nobody could have guessed. Katrine Wright had overseen more immigration cases than any active judge in the 7th Circuit. She had memorized entire sections of the Immigration and Nationality Act. She could recite 4th Amendment protections in her sleep. And she had spent years watching ICE agents like Richard Rubio bend the rules, fabricate urgency, and brutalize people who didn't know their rights. She knew exactly what he was doing. The checkpoint hummed with tension. Travelers whispered. Rubio's colleagues shifted their weight, glancing at each other with unease. Neither would voice. Rubio pressed forward. He asked if she had the documents or not, told her that if she couldn't produce proof of citizenship, he was authorized to detain her for further questioning. Katrine met his eyes, calm, steady, the same expression she'd worn for 40 years on the bench. She told him quietly that under Section 287 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, he was authorized to conduct inspections at ports of entry and within a reasonable distance of the border. That this checkpoint was not a port of entry, that he had no reasonable suspicion to detain her. Rubio blinked. Katrine continued. She explained that, under the 4th Amendment, she was protected from unreasonable searches and seizures. That a valid state-issued driver's license constituted sufficient proof of identity for domestic travel. That he was not legally entitled to demand ancestral documentation, expired visas, or any materials beyond standard identification. The murmurs grew louder, phones angled for better shots. Rubio's face reddened. He asked where she'd gotten her legal education. Katrine responded with Title 8, Code of Federal Regulations, Section 287.8, her voice never rising. She explained that his authority to question extended only to individuals reasonably suspected of immigration violations, that she was a U.S. citizen presenting valid government-issued identification, that he had no grounds for this stop. One of Rubio's colleagues coughed, the other checked his watch. Rubio stepped closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. He told her she was being awfully rude for someone who might not even belong here. Said it made him wonder if she had something to hide. Maybe she wasn't documented after all. Passengers gasped. A young woman in a business suit shook her head in disgust. Katrine reached into her wallet. Slow, deliberate, the same controlled motion she'd used 1,000 times to call order in a courtroom. She pulled out a card. Federal identification, embossed seal, official photograph. Katrine Grace Wright, United States federal judge, retired, District of Minnesota. She held it up. Rubio froze. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed. Recognition flickered behind his eyes, not just of her title, but of something deeper, something buried. A shiver ran down his spine. 2015, the deportation case. The immigrant family he'd testified against. The evidence he'd handled. The questions the judge had asked. Sharp and relentless. Questions that almost exposed what he'd done. That judge had been Katrine Wright. Rubio stammered. Told Judge Wright he didn't know, that he hadn't realized. Katrine responded softly. She said he didn't know. That was precisely the problem. That he'd assumed. Profiled, demanded documentation he had no legal right to request. And threatened detention without probable cause. Around them, phones captured everything. Passengers recorded. Airport security radios crackled. Rubio turned to his colleagues, suggested they step back. Called this routine. Katrine repeated the word, routine. She asked if that was what he called threatening a United States citizen with illegal detention, whether that was what he'd called it in 2015 when he testified in her courtroom about the Reyes family deportation. Rubio went pale. Katrine leaned closer, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. She told him his actions today mirrored patterns she'd seen before, patterns that suggested systemic misconduct, suggested he consider that carefully. Airport security intervened. 2 officers approached, requesting Rubio step aside for questioning. His colleagues backed away, distancing themselves with practiced ease. The crowd murmured. The video spread. Katrine gathered her carry-on, her expression unchanged. But inside, her mind raced. The way Rubio had phrased his demands, special verification process, it echoed something she'd heard before. Code language from her years on the bench, the kind of language agents used when they were running operations off the books. She walked toward her gate, her steps measured and calm. But her resolve was ignition. Because if Richard Rubio was still using those tactics, still targeting people with fabricated urgency, still tampering with the process the way she'd suspected years ago, then this wasn't just about one racist checkpoint encounter. This was about something larger. Something she'd failed to prove once before, and Katrine Wright did not fail twice. The bungalow sat on a quiet street in St. Paul, modest and unassuming, exactly like its owner. Katrine arrived home as the February sun dipped below the roofline, casting long shadows across her snow-dusted driveway. She set her bag down in the entryway and moved directly to her laptop. The video had already gone viral. 12,000 views, 20,000, 35. The numbers climbed as she watched. Comments flooded in outrage, support, disbelief. Clips had been edited, captioned, shared across platforms with hashtags demanding accountability. Katrine played the footage again, not for the spectacle, for the details. At timestamp 2 minutes 43 seconds, Rubio leaned in and said something the airport cameras hadn't fully captured, but Katrine remembered. He'd mentioned running a special verification process for cases like hers. Special verification process. She'd heard that phrase before, not in public testimony, not in official documents, but in sidebar conversations, in whispered exchanges between agents during depositions, in the coded language enforcement officers used when they thought judges weren't listening. It was shorthand, for operations that bent protocol, for processes that didn't appear in manuals. Katrine closed the laptop and walked to her bedroom closet. Behind the winter coats and storage bins sat a locked metal box, gray and dented, untouched for years. She retrieved the key from her jewelry drawer and opened it. Inside, case files, handwritten notes, depositions from her final years on the bench, and beneath them a sealed manila envelope with her name written in elegant cursive. Her mentor's handwriting. Thaddeus Franklin had been a pioneering civil rights attorney in Minneapolis. He'd argued before the Supreme Court twice. He'd defended protesters, immigrants, victims of police brutality. He'd trained Katrine when she was a young public defender, taught her how to see the law as a tool for justice instead of a weapon for control. He died in 2020, alone in his office, surrounded by files he'd never stopped reviewing. Before his death, he'd left her this envelope with instructions written on the outside to open it when she was ready to fight again. Katrine hadn't been ready. Not after retirement. Not after decades of being a symbol, a target, a headline. She opened it now. Inside, case notes from a 2015 deportation proceeding. The Reyes family. Eduardo Reyes, his wife Alma, their 3 children. ICE had accused them of using fraudulent documents to remain in the country. The evidence had seemed airtight until Katrine started asking questions. Why were the documents submitted to ICE different from the ones the family claimed to have filed? Why had Agent Richard Rubio been the sole handler of the physical evidence? Why did the paper stock and ink dating suggest the fraudulent documents were created after the family's initial filing? She'd raised these concerns in open court. Rubio had stammered through explanations. His supervisors had intervened, claiming procedural complexity. The case had been appealed, delayed, eventually settled with the family deported and Rubio reassigned. Katrine had suspected evidence tampering, but she'd had no proof. No whistleblowers. No digital trail. Thaddeus's notes went further. He documented patterns, other cases, other families, other agents who used identical language, special verification before evidence mysteriously shifted in ICE's favor. He'd written in the margins that this wasn't isolated, that it was systemic, that someone needed to connect the dots before more families were destroyed. Katrine set the notes down and stared at the wall. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Then she saw the callback number in the voicemail notification. Department of Justice, Washington, D.C. She answered. The voice on the other end identified herself as Elena Vasquez, senior investigator with DOJ Civil Rights Division. She said she'd seen the airport video, that they needed to talk. Katrine recognized the name. Vasquez had been a junior attorney during several of Katrine's immigration cases. Competent, cautious. Someone who followed the rules even when the rules protected the wrong people. Katrine told her she was listening. Vasquez's voice carried weight, exhaustion, something close to guilt. She explained she'd been reviewing ICE operations for the past 18 months, off the books, after hours. Because she'd missed something years ago, multiple somethings, and she thought Katrine had been right about the Reyes case, about Rubio, about all of it. Silence hung between them. Vasquez continued, saying she could pull internal records, communications, case files, reassignment logs, but she needed someone who knew what to look for, someone who'd already asked the right questions. Katrine exhaled slowly, told her to send everything she had, that she'd cross-reference it with her files. Vasquez thanked her, then apologized for not acting sooner. The line went dead. Katrine returned to her laptop. A new message waited in her social media inbox, flagged by the platform as potential spam but marked urgent by the sender. The message came from someone named Jordan Ellis. The subject line read, Airport video, full HD footage. The message explained that the sender had been at the checkpoint that day, had recorded everything on a phone with 4K resolution and full audio, that the edited clips online didn't show half of what Rubio had said. The sender identified as a software engineer who could enhance audio, isolate conversations, track metadata, offered to help if Katrine was going after Rubio. Mentioned that people like Rubio had destroyed the sender's cousin's family 3 years ago, deported on false pretenses. No answers ever provided. Maybe this time they could get some. Attached, 6 video files, time-stamped and labeled. Katrine downloaded them, opened the first, crystal clear footage. Rubio's sneer, his threats, and in the background audio, barely audible, one of his colleagues muttering to the other about why Rubio was pushing this when she was obviously documented. The other colleague's response mentioned knowing how Rubio got quota pressure. The streamlined process. Streamlined process. Katrine cross-referenced the phrase with Thaddeus's notes. It appeared 6 times across different cases, always in reference to expedited deportations, always connected to evidence that seemed too convenient. Her hands moved across the keyboard. She pulled up public records, federal court filings, ICE operational reports from the past decade. And there, buried in budget justifications and performance metrics, a pattern emerged. Agent Richard Rubio had been involved in 47 deportation cases since 2010. 32 had involved disputed evidence. 21 had resulted in families being separated, and in every single case, Rubio had been the primary evidence handler. Katrine leaned back in her chair. This wasn't just about one racist encounter at an airport. This was about a system that protected men like Rubio, that rewarded efficiency over accuracy, that turned human beings into statistics and called it border security. Amid the growing online buzz about the airport incident, one might wonder if such profiling has touched their own travels. Do you think everyday vigilance can spark real change? Share your story of facing a similar authority figure in the comments below, or type yes if you've been underestimated and risen above it. And consider sharing this video with someone who needs to see justice in action. 3 days later, Katrine sat across from Elena Vasquez and Jordan Ellis in a quiet coffee shop on University Avenue. No recording devices, no phones on the table. Just files, laptops, and the weight of what they'd uncovered. Vasquez spread documents across the table. She referenced an internal audit from 2023 that had flagged inconsistencies in document processing for deportation cases. Specifically, digital alterations to submission timestamps, forged notary seals, and evidence photos with mismatched metadata. Ellis pulled up a screen explaining that tracing Rubio's digital footprint had revealed activity on encrypted forms used by immigration enforcement. The username was BorderWatch47. The post had been bragging about streamlined verifications for years, coaching other agents on how to expedite removals. Katrine scanned the evidence. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind calculated angles, legal precedents, jurisdictional authority. She said quietly that this went beyond Rubio, that these patterns required supervisory approval, budget allocations, coordinated processing, that someone higher up was protecting this operation. Vasquez nodded, explained she'd identified 3 other agents and 2 supervisors with similar patterns, that if they filed a formal complaint, they could trigger a full investigation. Ellis asked what happened if Rubio realized they were on to him. Katrine met his eyes, told him then they'd move faster than he could. That night, Katrine drafted the complaint. 83 pages. Every citation exact. Every allegation supported. She included the airport video, Thaddeus's case notes, Vasquez's internal audits, Ellis's digital evidence, and her own sworn testimony about the 2015 Reyes case. She filed it electronically at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, the Department of Justice had flagged it for priority review. By 2 a.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The message was brief. Rubio's voice, strained and desperate. He said they needed to talk, that this had all been a misunderstanding, that he was just doing his job. Asked if she knew how it was. Pressure from above. Quotas. Pleaded with her. Said they could work this out. Katrine saved the recording. She didn't call back. Because Richard Rubio's desperation meant one thing. He knew exactly what he'd done. And he knew exactly who was coming for him. The investigation launched within 72 hours. And Katrine Wright, retired federal judge, invisible gardener, ghost in plain sight, became the architect of his undoing. The federal building in downtown Minneapolis stood cold and institutional, all concrete and glass, designed to intimidate through sheer bureaucratic weight. Katrine entered through the main doors on a gray March morning, her steps echoing across polished marble floors. The DOJ hearing convened in Conference Room 4B. No media, no public gallery. Just attorneys, investigators, witnesses, and the machinery of federal accountability grinding into motion. Katrine sat at the plaintiff's table, Vasquez beside her, files stacked in precise order. Ellis waited in the witness room, laptop ready. Across the aisle, Rubio sat flanked by 2 agency attorneys, his face pale, his hands clasped tight. The lead investigator, a severe woman named Holloway, called the room to order. Katrine presented first. She began with the airport video. The room watched in silence as Rubio's voice filled the speakers, demanding impossible documentation, sneering about people like her, threatening illegal detention. The timestamp showed every second. The angle captured every expression. Holloway took notes. The agency attorneys shifted in their seats. Katrine continued. She introduced the 2015 Reyes case file, read excerpts from the court transcript, highlighted her questions about evidence handling, about document inconsistencies, about Rubio's sole access to physical materials. Then she presented Thaddeus's research, cases spanning 8 years, patterns of disputed evidence, families deported on grounds that crumbled under scrutiny but only after appeals were exhausted, after people had already been removed from the country. Katrine stated that Agent Rubio's conduct at the airport was not an isolated incident of racial bias. that it was part of a sustained pattern of misconduct involving evidence fabrication, illegal profiling, and systematic abuse of authority. Rubio's attorney objected, addressed investigator Holloway, claiming Judge Wright had a documented history of ruling against ICE in immigration proceedings, that her bias against law enforcement was well established, that this was a personal vendetta disguised as something else. Holloway interrupted, noted that Judge Wright's judicial record showed 47% of her immigration rulings favored the government, that was hardly bias, told Katrine to continue. Katrine didn't smile. She simply moved to the next exhibit. Vasquez testified next. She detailed the internal audit findings, explained how she'd cross-referenced case files with digital records and found systematic alterations. Timestamps changed. Notary seals forged. Evidence photos with metadata proving they were created after the dates claimed in official reports. Vasquez admitted she'd missed this during her initial reviews, mentioned political pressure, caseload demands, institutional resistance to questioning ICE operations, said she'd failed the families those decisions destroyed, but that the pattern had always been there, that Agent Rubio wasn't working alone, that he'd had supervisory approval, budget support, and a network of colleagues who shared techniques on encrypted platforms. Rubio's attorney tried again, called the allegations speculative, said digital metadata could be manipulated, that internal audits were subject to interpretation, that they were building a conspiracy theory based on insufficient evidence. Ellis entered the room. He connected his laptop to the projection system. Lines of code filled the screen, forum posts, encrypted messages, user profiles. Ellis identified BorderWatch 47 as Agent Rubio's username on 3 different immigration enforcement forums. Showed a post from 2021 where the user described how to streamline verifications by creating duplicate documents with altered dates. Another from 2023 where the user coached an agent in Texas on managing evidence chains to avoid judicial scrutiny. Then Ellis pulled up a communication thread, a direct message between Rubio and his supervisor discussing quota pressures and the need to find creative solutions for problem cases. The timestamps matched periods when Katrine Wright's cases showed evidence inconsistencies. The room went silent. Rubio's attorney started to speak, stopped, looked at his client. Rubio stared at the screen, his face ashen. Holloway leaned forward, asked Agent Rubio if he denied that BorderWatch 47 was his account. Rubio's voice came out barely above a whisper, said that it was taken out of context, that he was just doing his job. Holloway asked if he denied authoring the posts. Rubio said no, but tried to continue. Holloway asked if he denied coordinating with supervisors to fabricate evidence. Silence. Holloway closed her folder, stated that, based on the evidence presented, she was recommending immediate termination of Rubio's employment with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, pending federal charges for obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, that any counter-accusations against Judge Wright were dismissed as baseless and retaliatory. Rubio's attorneys began conferring in frantic whispers. Holloway continued, said she was ordering a comprehensive review of all deportation cases handled by Agent Rubio between 2010 and 2026, with priority given to cases involving disputed evidence. That families wrongfully deported would be eligible for repatriation and restitution. The gavel fell. Rubio sat motionless, staring at nothing. The fallout came swiftly. Within 2 weeks, federal prosecutors filed charges against Rubio and 4 other agents. 2 supervisors were placed on administrative leave. The document forgery ring, operating for over a decade, collapsed under investigative pressure. 17 families began the process of returning to the United States, the Reyes family among them. Katrine received a call from Eduardo Reyes, his voice breaking with gratitude and grief for the years stolen. She listened. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply promised to advocate for systemic change so it wouldn't happen again. The Department of Justice established the Thaddeus Franklin Oversight Fund, dedicated to bias audits and independent reviews of immigration enforcement, mandatory body cameras, enhanced training on racial profiling, transparent evidence handling protocols. ICE resisted, then relented. Public pressure, combined with congressional scrutiny, left no room for deflection. Katrine attended the announcement ceremony at DOJ headquarters. She stood in the back, dressed simply, unnoticed by the cameras focused on officials at the podium. Vasquez found her afterward, told her she should be up there, that this was her work. Katrine shook her head, said the work wasn't about recognition, it was about accountability. She returned to St. Paul, to her bungalow, to her garden, where spring bulbs were beginning to break through thawing soil. But she didn't return to invisibility. Once a week, she mentored young civil rights attorneys at the University of Minnesota Law School. She taught them how to read case files for patterns, how to question authority without apology, how to use the law as a tool for justice instead of a weapon for control. She told them about the lesson that had guided her entire career, that laws don't discriminate, but people do, that their job was to make sure the law protected everyone equally, even when people tried to bend it. The viral video remained online, millions of views, thousands of comments, a case study in what happens when authority underestimates those it seeks to oppress. And in a federal courtroom in Minneapolis, Richard Rubio faced trial, convicted on 8 counts, sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. On the day of sentencing, Katrine visited Thaddeus's grave in Lakewood Cemetery. She placed fresh flowers beside his headstone and stood in the quiet. She told him softly that he'd been right, that someone had needed to connect the dots, that it had just taken her a while to be ready. The wind moved through the trees, the city hummed in the distance. Katrine walked back to her car, her steps steady, her purpose renewed. Because justice wasn't a spectacle, it wasn't a moment of viral triumph or a satisfying mic drop. Justice was method, patience, evidence, the slow, deliberate work of holding power accountable. And Katrine Wright had spent a lifetime perfecting that work. One checkpoint encounter had unraveled years of hidden corruption, restored families, exposed a system designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. But more than that, it had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten, that invisibility was a choice, not a requirement, that being seen, truly seen, could be a form of resistance, that the law, wielded properly, could still be a tool for justice, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do to those who abuse power is to simply stand their ground and refuse to be dismissed. Katrine drove home through the spring afternoon, the windows down, the air filled with promise. Somewhere, another federal agent was profiling another traveler. Somewhere, another family was being targeted by a system that valued efficiency over humanity. But somewhere else, a young attorney was reading case files with new eyes. A whistleblower was finding courage. A person underestimated was preparing to fight back. The work continued. And Katrine Wright, retired judge and visible gardener, architect of accountability, would be ready when the next call came. Because laws don't discriminate. People do. And she'd spend her life making sure the law won.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.